Hello, hello, and welcome to the User Research Strategist podcast. I am your host, Nikki, and I am joined today by Raymond. Hi, Raymond.
Hi, Nikki. Nice to be here.
I am so excited to have you here on the pod and to discuss our wonderful topic, which is balancing pragmatism and rigor as a user researcher, which to me feels like the most interesting thing that I can talk about today and slash in general. But before we get into that topic, do you mind just giving the audience a brief introduction on yourself?
Yeah, no worries. So I'm Raymond or Ray, and I'm a designer turned researcher. If you can't tell by my accent, I grew up in New Zealand, but I moved to the UK last year, so living that immigrant life. And my career started in graphic design and advertising, but I've also studied art history and as a brand strategist and an innovation consultant before moving into UX. And when I moved into UX, I was actually product designer rather than a researcher. So there was a bit of a transition period there, but I'm definitely where I belong. And I'm super passionate about the craft of UX research. So that's why I'm drawn to this particular topic that Nikki and I are going to be discussing about rigor and detail. But of course, there's a balance to be mindful of. So lately, I've been really enjoying thinking through how do we maximize what we do, but also keep it pragmatic and simplified where possible.
Amazing. Yeah, I am really excited because this is something that I struggled with, especially when I got into user research and especially as somebody who has been through quite a few startups as a researcher. It's like, okay, we want to do this rigorous process and get it right and have all the quality there, but we have no budget and we have no time and we have no this and we have no tool, we have no that. So I would love to just start out by asking you, for people who might not be as familiar with the topic, how would you define this balance between pragmatism and rigor?
Great question, Nikki. So I'm going to start, because there's two different words there. So I'm going to start with one of the words, and let's start with rigor. And often I find it useful to define something by what it's not and giving a contrast. So when we think rigor and our context that we're talking about is UX research, you can apply rigor in different ways. So one end of the spectrum is that kind of traditional academic rigor of, like scientific life or death research, where you really want like a good sample size, repeatable experiments. It's very scientific, hard science. So that's sort of like one end of rigor, I would say. And on the other end of rigor, you might have sort of like that kind of just enough research, like, okay, it's good enough. Maybe it's not perfect. Maybe it's like an 80% confidence level. And even that is just, a finger in the air sort of thing. So if those are the two sort of extremes of rigor, I would say what pragmatic rigor looks like is probably closer towards that second one of like just enough research. And Erica Hall has written that amazing book that many of us have read, and that has obviously informed a lot of my ideas here. But yeah, pragmatic rigor is on that end of the spectrum where we realize, hey, we're working in a business context. We need to give answers fast and at the cadence that the other teams are needing those answers in. And it's okay if we don't have 100% accuracy. It's okay that we don't have like the biggest and most perfect sample sizes according to best practice and methodology, because we're not saving lives here. Like it's just software that can always be redone. So it's very much on that end of the spectrum.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's really helpful to kind of put that into context of like this further end of the spectrum of like the most important research that everybody like that people are doing to like software. I will admit there is some software, there is some hardware out there that is super important and that does probably need like a different level of rigor. But generally speaking, we're kind of in that area. And I'm curious, like, because as a researcher myself, I get this, I get the stakeholder question of sample size and is it enough? And, data driven, we get all the buzzwords thrown at us, but we also get stakeholders who are like, oh, I heard this thing from one client, we must change. And I'm like, I don't understand, like, which way do you want to go? Choose a side. And I'm wondering, like, how do you deal with that, with like wanting to be perfect in that space and get the perfect sample size, the most ideal stuff versus actually making progress on something?
Yeah, great question. So as many of us working in software and modern products know, everything is a trade-off. So it's always about evaluating how much risk is involved, how much effort is involved, and what am I as a researcher who's leading this project actually comfortable with? and what are my strengths that I can bring to the table versus do we need to hire and commission an actual expert. And I recently listened to one of your podcasts, Nikki, talking the one about pricing research, and I completely agree that it is its own specialization. And yes, there are pragmatic ways of doing that, and that's great, but there are some specific, especially on the quant side of things, there are some very specific types of surveys that have been designed to answer certain questions quite robustly. So you need to tease out from the stakeholders, like what's their appetite for, 80% accuracy versus like 90% accuracy, if you can even measure that. And, what are the risk levels of getting it wrong? And also be honest about your own strengths as well. And I think by the time you've kind of considered all of those factors, you will probably have a spectrum of options that you can kind of walk them through, talking to them about the different trade-offs. And I think the PMs especially are probably going to appreciate that you kind of put your PM hat on and walk them through using their language and their frameworks and their mindsets to talk about what are the different trade-offs that we're making and what's appropriate for our little pocket of product that we own in the situation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I love that you brought up that PM hat and like the different trade-offs. And I'm curious, when you go to explain those trade-offs to stakeholders, maybe for people who aren't used to doing that, who are just like, here's our one research plan that we have to follow because this is how we do it. Like, how do you scope those trade-offs and like think through them to present like a good deal or packages to your stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as we like to say in the UX world, it depends. So I'm thinking through, your specific example of, I guess, a lower research maturity organization, which probably you don't quite have the relationship yet for them to just like fully trust you in that situation. So in that sense, I would sort of take on like a slower, more educational approach, because I think if you come in too strong with like, I'm the expert, just listen to me, it's probably going to put them off a little bit and you will get challenged on every single little thing. So in this case, it probably makes sense to kind of go slow a little bit where possible. And slow is very relative, I know, but it's worth kind of educating them on those trade-offs and explaining things like, with risk. I'm a very visual person, so we've often seen, those risk and importance matrices, like a 2 by 2 matrix where in one quadrant you've got like high risk, high importance, or high risk but low importance, and so on. And just like sketching things out like that to help people understand where you're coming from and where you see this project, and then inviting them into that process and being like, okay, well, what do you think? Like, do you agree? Would you say it's actually in this quadrant, or am I missing something? Is this actually higher risk than I thought it was?
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And I love being able to sketch out those things because I feel like they facilitate a discussion rather than like one kind of, as you're saying, one person as an expert coming in and being like, this is the way forward. And it's like more collaborative, I guess.
Yeah, I think using our research skills on the stakeholders to really tease out like why do they believe what they believe and why do they not trust you yet, and just try to address those unspoken needs through relationship building, really.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so I'm curious, when do you decide when more rigor is appropriate and when more pragmatism is appropriate? I know that when I started out, rigor was like everything because I came from academic research, which like literally everybody in my startup hated me for like wanting to do everything in this idealistic way. So I'm curious like how you decide when each is appropriate.
So I've got two answers to that. The first one we've covered already a little bit, which is risk. So really addressing that risk question head on and trying to tease out and align yourself, you and your stakeholders, what is the risk level here, and how important is it to know these things? Or do we have to know them now, or can we know them, 2 quarters down the line? So often that's kind of where a kickoff workshop would be really useful, where you tease out those high level scoping kind of questions. And often to save time, like a pragmatic tip is often to kind of throw them like a straw man. So kind of like like a bullet point, rough sketch of what you've got in mind, and let them attack it, tear it down, and, reiterate and iterate on it, because it's a lot easier for us to talk about things and build on things that are kind of tangible and in our face rather than just like airy fairy ideas that are in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
So perhaps one tip people can think about is, host a scoping workshop where you as a researcher leading it will inject a few straw man ideas that you hold very loosely to, and allow people to kind of poke apart and say like, actually, I don't like this because of X, Y, Z.
I love that. Okay, so like really looking at, again, coming back, collaborating with your stakeholders and saying, putting something tangible in front of them so that they can pick it apart rather than, yeah, a very broad or abstract idea.
Yeah, so that's the first point. And then the second point is maybe a little bit less actionable, but something that I think you and I will both resonate with and our audiences will as well, is this is why it's so important for us as researchers to know our craft and know what methods are actually out there and what methods are available and suitable and appropriate and not appropriate in different contexts. So whether you're an IC or a manager, I think you're going to have those tough conversations where stakeholders will come to you, and this has happened to me. Stakeholders will come to you based on your successful past project and say, we want another one of those because that was so amazing, and we just want another card sort, we want another blah. And you're like, wait, that was great in that context for that question, but you've got a new question now, and there's actually another type of survey, a specialized survey that we should be running to answer this particular question. And so if you didn't know those things, you probably would be kind of tempted to go down that path. And that's not necessarily wrong. Like in the name of pragmatism, sometimes it's, getting it done is better than just like, going forth and releasing something with no research at all. But that's where we add value as research specialists, because if you have that specialized knowledge of actually, did you know about the Van Westendorp pricing questions, and did you know about max diff, as opposed to like a random survey with like just, the usual radio buttons, I think that really helps you set yourself as, and just implicitly sets you apart as the expert. So you're not saying that you're an expert, but you're kind of implying it.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. Like you don't have to come out and say like, well, I'm the boss in the room for research, but like if somebody comes to you, you're not just running with it. And that's something that really does resonate with me because I used to react a lot to my stakeholders' requests. So rather than really thinking through, is this the best approach? They would be like, we need a usability test done on this thing yesterday. And I'm like, let's go. Right. Rather than really like thinking, oh, maybe it's not a usability test, which is hard to do.
Such a great point. Yeah.
Do you want to get all of your user research questions answered, all while hanging out on your couch in sweatpants? No need to join any live webinars and hope that your question gets answered. No need to Google a million different things and sift through some scattered advice that you don't really know is valid or reliable. Not anymore. I know it sounds too good to be true, but I promise it isn't, because if you become a paid Substack subscriber, you get access immediately to a community filled with user researchers that I am in every single day answering questions. Not only can you hang out on your couch, feel less alone as a user researcher, and get all of your questions answered, not only by an expert, but by a bunch of other user researchers with amazing perspectives and experience. You can do all of that on your couch in sweatpants, and I will be alongside there with you every step of the way. So join my paid Substack, get immediate access, and we can relax together solving all of your user research problems. See you there.
I'm curious because we talked a little bit about this like balance when it comes to the actual craft of choosing methodologies and doing research. But what about reporting and sharing research? Because I know a lot of people are like 50-page decks. A lot of people are like one-page summaries. A lot of people are like, screw all of that. Let's just do a Miro board. Like, how do you balance that within that sharing phase?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I've been reflecting on it as well, because since coming to the UK, I've had to start a new job. And so, new work culture, new culture of documentation or lack thereof. And, all of that kind of plays into what is actually going to be effective and impactful as you wrap up this project and preserve that knowledge for future researchers or just yourself going forward. So there's no, silver bullet answer to that. But what I can recommend is for people to really seriously think about defaulting to one-page summaries at the end of your data collection phase, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, because one-page summaries, it forces you to do the thinking. Like, you're the one who did the work. You are the best place to collate what is the most important information and insight and actionable takeaways to present to your stakeholders and the rest of the business. So if you can't do that, then okay, we probably have a bigger problem to talk about. But you're the one who scoped the project, you're the one who did the project, you're the one who did the analysis, and so you should be able to succinctly talk about what you learned and curate the points that will mean the most at this point in time to your stakeholders. And I often pair a one-page summary, which is usually text-based, with a highlight reel. So we use Dovetail at Dext, where I currently work, and that has been a really great combo. We can do qualitative research of presenting, hey, here's like very succinct one slide that you should be able to squeeze in, 5 minutes of your day to read as a stakeholder. And here's this, maximum 4-minute video highlight reel that shows you a bit more viscerally like what people are saying, what paying customers are actually saying about a product.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And I love pairing these things. It's like mixed methods research. It's like mixed method sharing. It's like really smart to be able to like combine a few different things for different types of learners, different types of ways of digesting the information. And so I'm curious with this one page summary, what is it? Because I think a lot of people struggle as researchers. We're like, everything's so important. Like we want to like highlight all the big things, all the small things, the one-offs. How do you decide what to put into something like that?
So I just visualizing my one pager now. So my template for it rather, that the past colleagues have inspired, obviously. So on the very left column, I start with kind of just the description of the study, basically like what did we actually test if it was a usability test? Like what was it? What triggered this research request? And that's going to be, like 2 sentences max. And then you might have sort of like the firmographics or demographics or psychographics of who you actually talked to. So your audience, like, hey, we talked to like segment A, segment B from these regions, and we had a sample size of, X people, just because those are the questions that kind of selfishly, like future researchers are going to want to know that because I want to know how valid was this research? How valid was this? How reliable is it for my new context when I'm looking at it, like 12 months from now, for another slightly different question. And I think those are just like a hygiene if you're going to build a research system that's going to be referenced in the future. So I try to start off with some of that context. And then I usually have like links to, the highlight reel, links to the analysis board, links to the script that I use, the links to maybe the analysis spreadsheet that I use if it was a survey. So those are kind of like here's everything in one place, like neatly packaged for you to use. And then if I've got space, then I might do a few screenshots of like, and here's a screenshot of like one important frame of that prototype, just so people visually know like what the heck's going on. What are you even talking about? So that's like the first column of like context, which might sound a lot for context, but I think it makes a difference. And then the middle is sort of your like, what did you learn? Like main takeaways. And because you've only got one column of one slide, there's not a whole lot you can really put in there. And this is coming from my graphic design days. We were kind of told like, it's not really good to have on like a digital slide, text that's too small because that's just like, not only does it look bad and you're obviously cramming things in, but it's just very hard to read. So normally, your text size will already dictate how much content you can really put in. And so often I think about, like if I was trapped in an elevator with a CEO for 5 minutes, not even 5 minutes, let's say 40 seconds, like what would be those 3 bullet points that I'd want to kind of get out of the way for her or him to think about from this research. So maybe that's one way of like really forcing yourself to be really brutal with like what are the actual takeaways. But again, it goes back to what you mentioned, which is scoping. Scoping is everything. So those are the objectives that you set out and you agreed with your stakeholders, like this is what we set out to learn. And especially with qualitative research, those objectives kind of change and wiggle around sometimes, and that's okay. But generally speaking, you have been asked by a particular product area to think about customers and their impact or their expectations on this product area. And so you're going to have to think about, what it's not the top 3 things that are important to you as a researcher. It's the top 3 things that are important to your stakeholders in the context of this product area that you've been asked to do the research for.
Yes. Oh my God. I wish we could. Oh, there's so much in there. Like, I don't even know where to start. Like, can we talk for another like 3 hours, please? Yeah, that's amazing. That's so helpful. And like, I love the 40 seconds in the elevator with the CEO. And I really love reiterating it's not what was important or stood out to us as researchers, but what would be for our stakeholders.
And I think I even forgot to talk about the third column of that.
There's another column.
So that was just the middle column. And then the third column is so what? The takeaways, the actual insights. Like, what does it actually mean? Yes, I struggle with this one because, I mean, that's a whole nother topic. But sometimes, like, you don't always know, especially if you're doing like a very fast findings, sort of like quick up the gate sort of one pager. But then it's up to you to really talk about like, so what? Like, what's the next steps? Like, what are we actually going to do? And those could be at different fidelities for different types of stakeholders. Like, the next step, sometimes there really is more research, especially from other stakeholders, like the commercial development team. They might need to do more quantitative research to release the size of the market up for this. And is this actually viable for us to do? But if it's a more tactical one, it could be the designers are ready to go or they've already got concepts to work on this. And you want to just reassure other stakeholders, hey, yep, design's got this. They know what they're doing and it's all good. So yeah, that third column is for actual takeaways, but I kind of reserve a whole column for that just because it's so important. Like that's the thing that people want to know what's going to happen next. So you kind of want to dedicate enough space for that and just let people know that you've thought about what the next step is and you're not just there to dump information on them. So you've carefully thought about what are the things that people around the business need to be doing in light of these takeaways.
Oh, I love that. That's such a beautiful summary of your one-page summary. So thank you so much for sharing. I think that's going to be so valuable for everybody. I'm switching gears slightly because I'm looking at the time and it just flies by so fast. But I wanted to ask you one more question because pragmatism is born out of constraints, right? We talked a little bit about like having these constraints of budget, of time, of whatever it might be. And I'm curious, how do you reframe these constraints in a positive way? Because I know I used to get pissed off, but I try not to anymore. And I'm curious what your mindset and process is with like dealing with these constraints that lead to this kind of pragmatic way of looking at research.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think this would be pretty much my takeaway for this whole podcast session with the two of us, which is, I have recently trained myself to see those constraints as creative challenges. So reframe a constraint as a creative challenge, essentially. So where you and I used to look at like, oh, we only have 2 weeks to do this. It's like, okay, normally in the past we would have been like, oh, that's so annoying. I want to add more rigor. I want to do it perfectly. I want to talk to enough people, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, okay, well, a phrase that I've recently learned to tap into is when you argue with reality, you lose 100% of the time. So that seems to resonate with you. So yeah. So as an idealist and a recovering perfectionist, I have really held on to that and tried to go with that rather than my instincts of, perfectionism. So I realized like, okay, this 2 week constraint, I've maybe gently pushed back or gently tried to understand the reasons behind that 2 week deadline. Like, is this arbitrary or is this like real? And let's just say like, okay, it's been ascertained that it is real, or even if, it's an ideal deadline, but you want to work on your pragmatism anyway. So I'm like, cool, I accept this challenge. I accept that this is going to be a 2 week constraint and this is reality. Like, let's work with reality. So within those 2 weeks, like what are the appropriate methods to add insight that will address the key questions that the stakeholder is asking? And then that is actually going to open up like a divergent creative phase for you as a researcher to tap into your knowledge of all the different methods that are at your disposal. And I think when you reframe it as a creative challenge, it becomes like way more fun. It just becomes way more interesting for you to just block out half a day with like a sketch pad and maybe just like the internet or ChatGPT and really just like talk through and think through with yourself or with others. What are some ways that we could break down this project or de-scope the project? That's something I've learned from my design days. Like, how do we de-scope this so that no one's pissed off at us? How do we de-scope this project so that we're hitting all the things that we need to hit and we've articulated those trade-offs so that everyone is on board and comfortable. And I feel good about this, that it's just enough research and just enough rigor for us to get to the next step. Because often, what you'll learn through this research, this primary research, is going to completely change what you were going to do in the future phases anyway. And recently, I've also learned it's not always primary research that we need to do. Sometimes it's good to invest secondary research, which is, looking at existing data, existing information, because if you're looking at information in a new light, that's a new interpretation that wasn't done before. And that can add so much insight and really speed up all the future projects and future thinking that is to come down the line.
Yeah, I love that. I think that we sometimes forget that there is secondary data out there, that there is secondary research and desk research and all these things that we can do in addition to the primary research that we have. And I love that you brought that up because, yeah, for a really long time, I ignored it. I didn't really think about it. And it is such a valid way to help inject some rigor into something that might feel a little bit too pragmatic and a little bit too on the edge. And I'm curious, like in addition to kind of that secondary research, are there other ways that you have learned to bring a little bit more rigor in when you are facing constraints? Like any favorite methods or approaches that you have to inject just a little bit more rigor?
It really depends on the exact nature of the research project. But I mean, my approach is always to work backwards from what you know to be reality. So you know that you have a particular deadline and they're expecting a specific output, or you know that your research has been to drive, concept testing or the release of a certain feature that needs to be done, around this time period, and your designer is wanting to start work on that at a certain point in time. So I often think about like, okay, working backwards, what do I actually need to do? And what is the nice to have that I can let go of? And I think a lot of things to us feel really critical, but if you ask another stakeholder to challenge you on that, like, oh, is this a must have or a nice to have? I think we'd be really surprised at how different our opinions could be. So that's another tip. Maybe just invite a non-research into your process and get them to challenge you directly on, do I actually need to do a report, or can it be a one-pager, or can it just be a conference page, or do I need to do like a really big formal presentation, or does it just have to, or can it just be with a core team? Can I do it asynchronously so I can do it just before I go on my holiday, if that's time constraint that you're working with? So yeah, invite people to challenge you, but also, it's another chance to activate your creativity and figure out how you get around those constraints, but still deliver just enough rigor and research so that you've answered the question on what you've been briefed to do.
Yeah, amazing. I love inviting that non-researcher part in because we can get so stuck in like a loop in our heads, and inviting somebody else in to really check, is this critical or not, can be so helpful. So I love that. That's actually a perfect place for us to end today, because sadly our time is up, and I'm so sad because I want to just chat forever about this as a recovering perfectionist myself. But Ray, thank you so, so much for your time today. This was so valuable. There were so many great things that people can take away. So I really, really appreciate you coming on the pod.
Thanks so much, Nikki. This was really fun. So thank you for inviting me.
Amazing. And thank you so much to the wonderful audience and listeners. I appreciate you taking the time to listen today. Please subscribe and follow and do all of the fun things that you can do to keep this pod in your inbox. I don't know. As you can tell, I'm experimenting with new endings, and it's clearly going so well. So all to say thank you, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.